Hey there. I'm doing a little video today about independent contractors versus employees. And I don't know why I'm getting so many questions about this right now. I think it might be because we're all sending out, 1099s and it's that sort of beginning of the tax season. But I'm getting a lot of like, is this person actually an independent contractor or are they an employee? And the answer to that question is a little bit complicated, which is why I think it is easy to ignore, or like it's one of the things that, it takes a bit of a deep dive into like what's going on with a bunch of different laws in order to understand whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. So I want to try to like clarify some of that for you. I may only confuse you more. And if that happens and you have a question about if someone's an independent contractor or an employee, or you're concerned about that with someone who's working for you, just reach out. I'd be happy to help. So there are a few legal tests that are used to determine whether someone qualifies to be an independent contractor. It's kind of like the default is if someone is working for you, they should be an employee. It is exceptional if they don't fit that sort of relationship. So a first question to ask yourself is, what state do you live in? Because some states have their own rules around who qualifies as an independent contractor and who doesn't. So some states that have their own laws about this are Alaska, California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Nebraska, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, Vermont, Washington, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. These states typically use a test that is called the ABC test. And I'm going to, share with you what those three things are, the A, B, and C, a little later on. But before we get to that test, I want to talk about some of the other tests that there are and some of the exceptions to that test that exist, because I think we get hung up on the ABC test when in fact, what some people may be doing, for work for us is actually falls into one of these exceptions. Okay. So I'm going to list exceptions from California because I live in California and these are the ones that I'm most familiar with. But if you live in another state that I named, then you can look up what kinds of exceptions there are to the ABC rule for different kinds of professions. So in California, the professions that I'm about to list are exempted from the ABC test, and there is a different test that's called the Borello test that is used with them. And again, I'm going to get into the details about like what that test actually is. And a test basically in the law is a question, and the way that you answer the question either passes or doesn't pass the test. So people that are subject to the Borello test and then some other profession-specific questions or test pieces are medical professionals like physicians, surgeons, dentists, podiatrists, psychologists, and veterinarians, insurance brokers, underwriters, premium auditors, and risk managers, lawyers, architects, landscape architects, and engineers, private investigators, accountants, registered security broker dealers and investment advisors, direct salespeople. They can't be paid by the hour and they have to have written contracts. Manufactured housing salespersons, people that are engaged in an international exchange visitor program, competition judges like umpires and referees, workers providing professional services, freelance writers and editors, licensed barbers, electrologists, cosmetologists, and estheticians, business to business contractors, single engagement events, that's like people who are employed for just one event, construction subcontractors, real estate licensees, music industry people like promoters and bands and lighting professionals and things like that, businesses that obtain work through referral agencies like dog walkers, people like that, and then app-based rideshare and delivery drivers. So if you have someone who is performing work for you that is, that I just listed one of their professions, then we use the Borello test. And then sometimes there's also a professional test set of questions that's involved. So if you have one of these and you're not quite sure, again, reach out, happy to talk through it with you. It's like this, it's like a decision tree. So, for example, if you have a lawyer who works for you, then the Borello test applies. If you have an accountant or, these different various things, if you have someone who has their own business who is providing services to your business, then the business to business contractors one applies, and that has its own set of kind of questions that go with it. So let's do an example. One that comes up where I go through the questions kind of often is workers providing professional services. So I have maybe a marketing person who is doing marketing for me. I'm sending them a 1099, but should they actually be an employee of mine? So the first thing we do is we look at the Borello test. And the most significant factor in this test is whether the hiring firm has control or the right to control the worker, both as to the work that is done and the manner and means in which it is performed. So that means that if I am scheduling someone to show up at a certain time, then that looks more like an employee. Whereas if I'm just saying, I want you to, put up, 5 posts a week on this social media platform, I'm leaving it up to you as to how that gets done, that looks more like an independent contractor. If I am overseeing and providing corrections and training someone on things, or providing ongoing feedback, that looks more like an employee than an independent contractor, where with an independent contractor, they're usually more qualified and I'm just expecting them to, for example, not have spelling mistakes or have awful graphics or whatever, if we're talking about a marketing person. So that's the most significant factor, but then there are other factors that come into play also. So whether the worker is engaged in an occupation or business that is distinct from that of the hiring firm. So if I am a marketing firm and I am hiring a marketing person as a 1099 contractor to perform work for my clients, that looks more like an employee than if I am a law firm and I'm hiring a marketing person to market my law firm. Then there's also the aspect of that, which is, does this person have their own business? Do they, are they a sole proprietor? Do they have a DBA? Do they have an LLC? Are they in some way their own entity, their business entity is distinct from my own? Then there is whether the hiring firm or the worker supplies their equipment and tools and place for work. An independent contractor supplies their own equipment and tools and workspace, and an employee is provided those things. Another part of this is the skill that's required in the occupation. I talked about that previously, but that kind of gets at the amount of oversight that you have over the employee. A more skilled employee or a more skilled professional looks more like an independent contractor, whereas a less skilled professional looks more like an employee. There's also the worker's opportunity for profit or loss. So, as an independent contractor, I have an agreement with a hiring entity about how much I'm going to be paid for a certain project, maybe. That's a great way to pay independent contractors is per project instead of per hour. Um, and so then, it is on me as to how profitable that project is for me. If I, am very efficient with my time, then it becomes a more profitable project. But if I am less efficient with my time, or if I need to make other investments in order to be able to deliver the final product, then that's all on me. The profit or loss of it is all on me instead of on the hiring firm. There's also a question as to how long services are going to be performed. So services that are performed on a short-term basis look more like an independent contractor or for a defined period of time, whereas services that are performed kind of indefinitely into the future with no end date or no revisit to the end of the contract looks more like an employee. The degree of permanence of the working relationship is a consideration. Again, if it is a permanent relationship, that looks more like an employee. And if it is a short-term relationship, that looks more like an independent contractor. Let's see. There's also a part about the Borello test that talks about whether the parties believe they're creating an employer-employee relationship. So something to consider about this test. Now, again, it's only for those jobs that are exempt from the ABC test in those states where the ABC test is used. But the first piece of it, whether the person's work, whether the person is receiving a lot of direction or really has their own freedom about how the work is performed is the primary consideration. But all of these other things can be factored into a determination as well. So the more someone looks like an independent contractor, the better it all looks. And the more someone looks like an employee, the more likely it is that you would want to convert them into an employee in order to mitigate your risk. And I'll talk about what that risk looks like, at least in California, in a bit. So with a professional worker in California, there are additional requirements that they have to have. And so, like I said, some professions don't have these, other professions do. So with this one that we're talking about right now, which is workers providing professional services, additional requirements include having a business license and any like licenses or permits that they need, being able to set or negotiate their own rates. So if you're telling someone how much you're paying for something, that looks more like an employee than an independent contractor. Whereas with an independent contractor, you describe the scope of the work that you're looking for, and then they usually would send you a proposal. And then you can negotiate on that amount that's in the proposal, but the initial number usually comes from, at least in writing, from the independent contractor. They need to be able to set their own hours and be customarily engaged in the same type of work under contract with another firm, or hold themselves out to other potential customers as available to perform the same type of work. And then regularly and customarily exercise discretion and independent judgment in performing their services. So they like basically, in order for someone to pass under this Borello test, they need to meet an exception in the state where you live, like an exception from the ABC test in the state where you live. And then you have to be able to basically show that they have the freedom to do the work in their own way, that they are qualified to do it on their own, that, they are set up as a business, that they are, you know, setting their own rates. There's some kind of a, contract in place between you and them. And so there are some situations where, someone, maybe they look more like an employee right now, but if you change a few things, then they can look more like an independent contractor. And so there's kind of this, an iteration of, like, if you want to continue having someone paid as an independent contractor, sometimes there are things that you can do to make them fit that better than being an employee. And it has to do with the way that you are able to show that the relationship meets these requirements. And it's the same when we get to the ABC test, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So the ABC test is different from the Borello test, because with the Borello test, remember, there's that one piece that's really important, and then the rest of it is also considered. Whereas with the ABC test, you have to meet all three pieces. Like they have to look like a contractor in all three of these ways, or else they are an employee. So the ABC test is used in those states that I mentioned previously. If you are in a state that I did not mention, then just contact me and we can kind of look at how it works in your individual state. They all are a little bit different from one another. But a lot of folks will fall into this ABC test zone. So the first question there is similar to the Borello test, which is the worker free from the control and direction of the hiring organization in connection with the performance of work? And so control and direction look like setting the schedule, setting the rate of pay, you determining the timeline of work within the project, not leaving the contractor open to deciding, when things are going to be happening. Although you can have agreements about deliverables and time that are a part of your contract. Control and direction also looks like training. So you can do a little bit of training in the beginning with an independent contractor to get them up to speed with, for example, a system that you're using. But having a person participate in ongoing training or receiving ongoing feedback from like a manager or from an owner of a company is not something that looks like an independent contractor. That looks like an employee. So if you're doing any of those things, your answer to this first one is no. And that means that the person is an employee. And so that means that you need to pay them as an employee. The second question in the ABC test is, does the worker perform work that is outside the hiring entity's business? And that's similar to the question that I posed before around the marketing person, whether they're doing marketing for a marketing firm and working with that marketing firm's clients, for example, or creating deliverables for clients, or whether they're doing marketing for a law firm. When you have someone who's doing marketing for a law firm, the marketing may be outside of the hiring entity's business. Whereas if the marketing person is working for a marketing firm and doing work for clients, then that is definitely within the scope of the hiring entity's business. So it's kind of a way to mitigate subcontracting unless the person has their own business. If someone has their own business, then they can be a business to business contractor, which is separate from, which has its own exemption. And then you have to follow those rules there. But if you just have someone who does not own their own business and they are doing work that is within the scope of your business's, work, like what you're providing to your clients, like a yoga instructor or something like that, that person's an employee. So that your answer to this question is no, that person is an employee. And so then we get into, what to do about that. The third question is the worker routinely doing work in an independently established trade, occupation, or business that is the same as the work being requested and performed? So basically, a way to answer this is the person doing this work for other people? Or do they, like the other one was worded, do they hold themselves out to be available for this kind of work with others also? And if your answer to that is no, for example, this person is working full time for you, they're not working for anyone else, then that person's an employee. If they're not routinely doing work in other places that are the same as the work that you're requesting them to perform, then they are not an independent contractor, they're an employee instead. And so then the question is like, okay, maybe I have someone who's working for me that actually should be an employee. What is my risk? And again, risk is different state to state. It depends on kind of who is auditing this information in each state. So I'm going to stick with California since we've been talking about California this whole time. So in California, the organization that audits payroll is the Employment Development Department. And when there is a payroll audit, that is when the classification of employees comes into play. And when you'll be told whether you have misclassified people or not. So that looks like the last 3 years of payments that you have made to people. So it starts with the most recent calendar quarter that was completed, and it goes back 3 years from there. And so what you're liable for are all taxes that were supposed to be paid on related to payroll. So those are payments that go to, disability and unemployment and all these different things. There's a whole list. So it can get very expensive if you have lots of people who are working for you, or there is a lot of, there are high amounts of dollars that are being spent. So, one way to keep your people as independent contractors and like prepare to deal with that risk if it comes up is to set up a savings bucket to deal with, EDD, payroll, tax if it comes through, right? Like you can just start saving now to deal with it. Another way to do it is to decide to convert your employees, your independent contractors to employees. And if that's a process you want to talk about, I'd be happy to do that. It would probably take about 30 minutes and it's pretty specific to your business. So, so I'd recommend reaching out. I hope that this was helpful and did not just confuse you further. And again, if you have any questions or anything is coming up for you, please reach out.